Contemporary commentary likes to pin today's populist revolt on the anger of the white working class. This diagnosis is completely blind, because long before grievances erupted in the West, there is another white working class which went through a collapse far more severe than anything that has been described in the J.D. Vance book, Hillbilly Elegy. In the 1990s, across Russia, Ukraine, and much of Eastern Europe, the shift to neoliberal capitalism has produced a peacetime social breakdown. The life expectancy dropped, household savings wiped out, and crime and drug use surged. There is something almost poetic about what followed. 3 decades after the Soviet Union collapse, the first shots that unraveled the world order were fired again right at where it started. When Vladimir Putin announced the special military operation in Ukraine on February 24, 2022, it wasn't just the end of an era. It was a moment when neoliberalism ran into its own reckoning. For all of that, the last 3 decades were also the most peaceful period in the human history. Since 1991, there has been no large-scale military conflict between major powers. Even the regional wars on the scale of Vietnam or Korea have been absent. By 2016, the global battle deaths per capita had fallen to roughly 2 per 100,000 people. That was more than a 95% decline from the 1950s. As wars became rare and less destructive, the nation-states redirected their resources toward growth, economic growth. The global military spending fell by nearly half between 1990 and 2008. Around 30 countries abolished their conscriptions. So the result was called a peace dividend, which helped to push global GDP growth above 3.5% throughout the 1990s and 2000s. So, 2 neoliberal era trends underwrite such long peace. The first one was economic interdependence, built on a deceptive premise that economic rationality would crowd out the political conflicts. So, that groundwork was laid in the 1980s, that most advanced economies had reduced the debts they carried from the World War II, while a global youth generation driven largely by the post-war baby boomers in the emerging markets, they pour into the labor force. That combination set the stage for what the Italian sociologist Giovanni Arrighi had called a global capital cycle, where the physical assets built in the 3 post-war decades became increasingly financialized. So what followed was a period of prosperity broad enough to neutralize even serious discontents. So the class tensions between labor and capital in Europe and North America were diffused in 2 ways. One is the offshore production to the emerging markets, which deindustrialized societies and pivot toward the so-called smart economy that is dominated by finance and professional services. Across the global south, the pool of capital inflows from advanced economies was so strong that even governments born out of anti-colonial revolution adjusted their policies to become business-friendly. Then globalization reinforced the whole structure. The multinational corporations diversified their supply chains and created this dense interdependence among nation-states in the world economy. By the year 2008, international trade reached almost 60% of global GDP. Under such arrangements, the war wasn't just undesirable, but impossible. Since the heavy industries needed for the prolonged and protracted warfare were dispersed across borders, the states lost the concentrated material base to fight the large-scale conflicts. Then the second stabilizing trend was democratization, or so-called waves of democracies. Beginning in the 1970s, the world saw a cascade toward Western-style democracy, known as the third wave, following the earlier expansions in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Between 1970 and 2000, the share of the countries that meets the Freedom House criteria for democracy rise from 25% to 63%. So by the end of the Cold War, the electoral democracy looked like it had beaten every other alternative. That triumphalist attitude peaked with the Francis Fukuyama's declaration of the end of history in 1989. But the waves of democracies actually came with a deeper shift in global governance. The collapse of the Soviet Eastern Bloc was widely seen as proof that the political legitimacy comes from material prosperity, not from the ideological faith. A powerful conclusion followed that the main job of the government is to deliver economic growth. However, to keep the democracy aligned with that job, democracy itself had to be redesigned as liberal democracy. So in theory, that means the Lockean version of limited government, constrained by institutions to prevent the tyranny of the majority. But in practice, it increasingly meant the dominance of global capital. So the nation states was treated as a necessary evil to only enforce contracts and face the market failures. Objectively speaking, this capital-led political economy did create strong incentives for peace. Because industrial capital in the 20th century, they fed on the physical resources and they need the ever-expanding territorial markets. But the financial markets, the financial capital in the 21st century, could just earn the returns detached from the actual production. So profit depends less on conquest than on the circulation of assets, which are the values extracted by brokering transactions like what Wall Street does. So in that world, the 20th century style war, where finance is fully mobilized for national struggles, becomes deeply unattractive. The resulting aversion to war produced a statistical illusion that seemed to confirm democratic peace theory, which is the idea that democracies or democratic nations will never fight with each other. So with transnational commitments to growth and relative peace, the early 21st century looked like the end of history had actually arrived, because no rupture seemed imminent, but the cracks were visible from the very beginning. In year 1996, Samuel Huntington actually published The Clash of Civilizations, which is a great book. He argued that the end of ideological conflict will not produce harmony. It will only expose the older sources of violence. Culture, religion, ethnicity, and modern institutions would struggle to contain these forces. He also warned that the West, despite winning the Cold War, was entering a phase of strategic exhaustion. Over time, that Confucian, Orthodox, and Islamic civilizations will challenge the Western dominance as the system drifts back toward multipolarity. Underneath Huntington's civilizational language was a realist argument about power. He had put this bluntly that the West win the Cold War not through the superiority of their values or religion, but through the superiority in the organized violence. That stability actually produced by the interdependence and the liberal democracy obscured a structural fact that the United States stood unchallenged on the world stage. No one actually understood this better than the American policymakers themselves. Brzezinski, the national security advisor for Jimmy Carter, called the United States the first and possibly the last global superpower. Brzezinski argued for restraint and careful use of the smart power, but other people were less disciplined. There's a guy called Karl Rove, which captured the prevailing mood when he said, "We are an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality." That hubris actually came with anxiety. In 1990, the Charles Krauthammer coined the unipolar moment to stress that American primacy would be temporary. So the implication was this: exploit the window of opportunity, lock in the advantages before rivals emerge. Under that logic, the unilateral action becomes justified and the international law becomes just optional, regardless of the broader consequences. 3 episodes illustrate this approach. First was the humiliation of Russia. Back in 1990, during the negotiations over German reunification, Gorbachev actually accepted a unified Germany inside NATO, but on the basis that NATO will not expand eastward. Moscow's expectation was that the end of the Cold War will dissolve the military blocs in Europe and leave a neutral security space. These expectations quickly faded away. The NATO expansion to eastward actually started in 1999 and again in 2004, putting the former Warsaw Pact members and former Soviet states. In year 1999, a US-led NATO coalition bombed Serbia, which was Russia's last major ally in Europe, without authorization from the UN Security Council. It ended with Kosovo's secession, and through these moves, the United States has weakened Europe's post-Cold War security architecture long before the Russian intervention in Ukraine in 2014. So George Kennan, the architect of the containment strategy back in the Cold War, warned that the NATO expansion will kill Russia's democratic experiment and trigger a new Cold War. And both warnings actually proved right. Russia, marginalized and strategically encircled, made the conclusion that it had little to gain from the neoliberal international order, so it shifted toward a revisionist agenda. The second episode was the robbery of Asia. With Russia weakened and China still rising, Japan was the most formidable challenger to the United States in the 1990s. By that decade, the Japanese economy reached nearly 75% of US GDP and 20% of the global GDP. Washington could not outcompete Japan's industrial model on its own terms. So the fear was both strategic and economic, that a strong Japan might demand real autonomy and build a rival economic order. Worse than that, Japan's success rested on a political economy that resisted the neoliberal doctrines, so Japan had to be broken. During the Asian financial crisis of 1997 to 1998, the speculative attacks ripped through the Asian currencies. The IMF rescue packages imposed the sweeping liberalization on these affected countries, triggering massive devaluations and asset collapses. When the crisis reached Japan, the IMF pushed the closure of distressed banks and imposed losses on domestic stakeholders. So the result was a prolonged stagnation, which actually persists all the way till today. For the American financial elites, the crisis was a windfall. The distressed Asian assets were snapped up by Western investors, producing a major redistribution of ownership. China has learned a lesson. Watching the United States dismantle the economy of a strategic ally produced a hard clarity in Beijing that the economic interdependence promised by the neoliberal globalization was conditional and asymmetrical. A system centered on the American financial power will give Washington extraordinary leverage. International finance could be weaponized against rivals when needed at any moment. So that's the reason why China began building its own countervailing dependence. Since joining the WTO in 2001, it has moved up the value chain while preserving the full spectrum industrial supply chains. By 2025, China controls nearly 1/3 of global industrial output and dominates more than 40% of the industrial production, including steel and aluminum. Today, the United States and the West depend on China for nearly 90% of rare earth materials, along with other critical goods such as medicines and solar panels. And mutual dependence means the United States cannot bring China to its knees the way it did to Japan back in the 1990s. Now, the most disastrous episode was the so-called freedom agenda in the Middle East. After September 11, 2001, the United States launched a global war on terror. George W. Bush insisted the perpetrators hated America's freedom, that as if terrorism were simply the product of too little democracy. From that premise came a clear solution: regime change by force. Then the construction of model democracies that would trigger a domino effect, which is an echo of what happened in Eastern Europe back in 1989. The result obviously was catastrophic. In Iraq and Afghanistan, the collapse of existing authority didn't just clear the way for democratic consolidation. It actually unleashed the more horrible sectarian conflict and infused the religious extremism. We've all seen ISIS. The United States wasted vast resources into nation-building projects. But in 2014, only 3 years after the US withdrew from Iraq, ISIS surged, and it threw Iraq and the wider region back into war. So the final irony arrived in 2021, after 20 years of war, which is the longest one in the American history. Taliban returned to power in Kabul. The Afghan fiasco triggered a moment of global reckoning that many treated it as the return of history, proof of the limits on the American power. Francis Fukuyama rejected that reading and argued again that the episode revealed a growing polarization of commitment inside the West. But that defense exposes a deeper question. Why did Western societies, Americans in particular, grow so exhausted by policies that much of the world still view as the privilege of the hegemon? The answer lies in the distributional consequences of neoliberalism. The same economic system that underwrite the American primacy also created the strong incentives for Washington to weaken the rules and institutions that made such primacy possible. Neoliberalism produced a stratified global economy. At the core was the United States, specializing in finance, professional services, and frontier technologies, extracting rents through the capital markets, intellectual property rights, and its own global reserve currency, the US dollar. Around that core sat a first periphery, which is Western Europe and Japan, focused on advanced manufacturing, but operating inside the US-dominated financial and security architectures. Beyond that lay a second periphery, which is China and much of the global South countries, supplying cheap labor, raw materials, and standardized industrial outputs. This arrangement has consolidated the US hegemony and delivered extraordinary profits to American elites, especially in finance and technology, so basically the Wall Street and Silicon Valley, while hollowing out the American middle class through deindustrialization. As social mobility narrowed, the military service became one of the few remaining ladders. So a paradox followed. The wider US hegemony spread abroad, the more stratification deepened at home, producing more soldiers to sustain that hegemony. But over time, this became politically unsustainable. Veterans became a voting bloc, and society could no longer ignore their costs and their votes. Support for the US-led international order eroded as the burdens grew concentrated while the benefits became uneven and opaque. That erosion now shows up as widespread American skepticism toward the very international norms which the United States once championed. And it wasn't just only about popular disaffection. The neoliberalism also produced the institutional resistance inside the United States to bending international constraints. The neoliberal revolution of the 1980s, inaugurated under Reagan, reshaped the US economy. By the early 1990s, the United States had shifted from the world's largest net creditor to a structural debtor for the first time in history. Chronic budget deficits and trade imbalances became permanent, and liabilities accumulated on a scale large enough that national debt rose beyond 100% of GDP. So that shift has permanently altered the America's relationship to the international order, because a debtor hegemon lacks both the political capacity and the incentive to honor its own obligations in real terms. So as the rule-based international order weakened, so did the norms governing such economic statecraft, giving Washington more room to deploy tools it once condemned, especially like monetary expansion and inflation, in order to manage its own liabilities. And looking forward, there will be a temptation to rig the system that Washington once built in order to escape such debt obligations. So today, the normative architecture of the post-Cold War order has been largely hollowed out. The cumulative effect of US behavior has made one point hard to deny. that the international law has increasingly functioned less as an objective constraint than as an instrument of power. And the irony is that this unwillingness to bend itself to its own rules actually helped create the conditions for the rise of its principal challenger, which is China. Since the 1990s, many American statesmen, including Bill Clinton, has argued that lasting US leadership depended on the self-restraint. The logic was quite strategic. If Washington has embedded its power inside institutions that constrain its own freedom of action, it could set the precedent to discipline future hegemons once the American primacy inevitably declined. But the United States moved in the opposite direction. And by doing so, it actually eroded the legitimacy it would later need to demand the compliance from other countries. Nothing captures this more clearly than the 2016 South China Sea arbitration. Washington has insisted that China comply with the UNCLOS, which stands for the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. But Beijing has dismissed the ruling as an irrelevant piece of paper and refused to participate. And its defense was actually quite simple, that the United States itself is not a party to such treaty. So the USA itself is not a party to the UNCLOS. So as the world enters multipolarity, the lack of a shared normative foundation becomes much dangerous. The multipolarity by definition means several great powers competing within one system, which, that makes it inherently unstable. Historically, the multipolar system endures only when major powers restrain themselves and agree, explicitly or implicitly, on rules of conduct and legitimacy. The Council of Europe after the Napoleon Wars held for nearly a century because the great powers converged on what was acceptable norms. After World War I, the League of Nations failed because it didn't have such norms, and the multipolar world order collapsed quickly, giving way to bipolar confrontation in the Cold War. That's why the need for a new framework of great power coordination is growing way more urgent. The two pillars of post-Cold War peace have proven inadequate. Economic interdependence was supposed to deter war, but now it breaks under acute insecurity. Russia's conflict in Ukraine shows that once leaders perceive core interests at stake, economic cost becomes acceptable. Then the democratic peace theory also fares no better. The history of conflict between democratic India and Pakistan, most recently in the year of 2025, shows how elections can intensify the nationalism instead of just moderating it, especially when domestic incentives reward the confrontation. So nuclear deterrence remains the only effective constraint on a great power conflict. But its effectiveness carries a poison pill. It encourages the proliferation on the world stage. A new nuclear arms race is no longer a distant abstraction. It's on the horizon now. And even if nuclear fear prevents direct war among great powers, the expansion of multipolarity has already produced multiple flashpoints. The Middle East right now has become a flashpoint for the major war. For decades, the US engagement was justified by its dependence on the Middle Eastern energy and the need to secure global trade routes. That rationale has weakened sharply with the American energy independence. The United States right now has less incentive to play the role of a stabilizing hegemon rather than just doing the wrecking ball politics. Washington's priority has shifted toward denying influence to rivals, especially China and Russia. The result is a very destabilizing posture, that the United States is no longer willing to guarantee order in the world, but remains willing to disrupt arrangements that threaten its own dominance. And this just reshapes the incentives for the regional actors in the Middle East as well. Israel in particular, because it faces a narrowing window of maximum US backing, it chose to attack Iran preemptively. And now, April 2026, we've seen what's been coming. Then Europe is the second fault line. The United States remains part of NATO, but the substance has been fading. Washington has shown a growing willingness to treat Europe as a proxy battleground, and most clearly in Ukraine, where the strategic aim has been to degrade Russian power, not to rebuild a stable European security architecture. That posture accelerates the fragmentation inside NATO, since the European states move towards self-reliance. And if Russia comes out of a prolonged confrontation with the West, the favorable outcome from the conflict with Ukraine, then a wider European war in the 2030s, or even closer, is very likely. Now, East Asia. It is the most consequential theater, because unlike Europe or the Middle East, the United States remains deeply committed to its former allies, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the Philippines. China, for its part, has shown little interest in starting direct conflict with these states. But Washington, however, has increasingly looked to non-allied partners like India and Vietnam, trying to create these Afghanistan-style strategic quagmires for China. Beijing has little appetite for that kind of entanglement, and there's a paradox here. China's deep integration into the global economy has reduced its incentive to start wars that does not touch upon its core interest. And that core interest is Taiwan. Taiwan's leadership has strong incentives to internationalize its security dilemma and binding itself as tightly as possible to the US allies like Japan, so that the United States is pulled into a potential war by allies. China, conversely, aims to deter outside involvement by making the cause explicit, demonstrating that any conflict will impose unacceptable damage to the United States itself. So this contest entanglement versus deterrence is exactly why Taiwan is the most plausible trigger for the direct great power confrontation in the coming decades. Now, even if none of these conflicts actually materialize, the erosion of the neoliberal globalization will still impose large costs. The late 20th century's free flow of goods, capital, and labor is unlikely to return because the nation-states now will prioritize the self-reliance and strategic autonomy. But losing these arrangements may also create the conditions for renewal. Neoliberalism raised efficiency, but it also drained the societies of collective purpose. It hides the political trade-offs behind technocratic management and suppresses the strategic arguments about the future. The peace which it once produced came with a hollow politics, hyper-competitive yet empty, unable to mobilize societies for anything beyond consumption. In that sense, here is the good news. The return of great power competition repoliticized international relations in a necessary way. The nation-states now are forced back into the fundamental questions of long-term survival for its own populations. What follows will be painful, but unavoidable. Arguments over naked national interests versus the abstract universalism that defined the neoliberal era. This restores the political agency by making populations confront the consequences of their collective choices. It also opens space for institutional innovation and intellectual reinvention, because societies right now will have to invest in new forms of political organization and ideologies that are capable of sustaining the competition in a new security environment. The return of history then may not just be unavoidable, it might be necessary. When the post-Cold War era is finally written as history, the central indictment may be that the neoliberalism functioned as the funeral procession of the American empire. The previous argument about the long 20th century is also useful here, that capitalism moves in cycles of accumulation. It starts with expansion in trade and production. As the profit rates fall, it retreats into finance. Financialization is not vitality, it is exhaustion. Neoliberalism, as the ideological superstructure of this financial capital, should be read less as the accumulation of American ascendancy than as a symptom of imperial decline. From the start, neoliberalism was ideologically incoherent. It claimed to depoliticize the economic life through markets and technocratic governance. But in practice, it only entrenched the oligarchs and eroded the social cohesion. It couldn't suppress the discontent it self-generated. It only displaced it first into the identity politics, where the distributive conflict was reframed as a cultural war, and later into increasingly abstract fanaticisms detached from the material reform. When those mechanisms stopped working, war and geopolitical confrontation became the final outlet for contradictions that had never been resolved. So, the real historical choice was never between war and peace. It was between collective self-restraint and collective self-destruction. In that context, multipolarity right now is not merely an outcome. It is also a corrective. The lesson of the neoliberal era is not that order is impossible, but that order cannot be entrusted to capital alone. With the return of the nation states and the reassertion of popular political agency, the breakdown of the old order may become the foundation for something more resilient and more sustainable. Thanks for watching. This is Curtis at Sinopolitik. See you next time.